All right, so welcome to Basics of Biomedical Engineering. I'm Becky. I have a bachelor's degree in bioengineering, and in a couple weeks, I'll be starting my PhD in biomedical engineering. So this is a topic that I'm really passionate about, and I'm really excited that I'll get to share it with you guys today. And also, if you have any questions throughout the class, feel free to just either unmute yourself, raise your hand, send questions in the chat. You don't have to wait till the end or anything. So send your questions at any time. This class is for you. The whole point is for you guys to get a good experience and to learn as much as possible about this topic. So as you saw when you signed up for the class, this is a pretty surface level class, just an opportunity for you guys to get your feet wet and learn more about this topic, whether this is something you're thinking about pursuing in the future or something you've read articles about or something you just think is neat and you want to learn more about it. So we're going to start off with the definition of what biomedical engineering is exactly. Then we're going to go into some different subfields and explain different areas that all fit underneath the umbrella of biomedical engineering or BME. And we're going to talk about some specific real life examples from each one that you might already be familiar with or you might have heard of. And then at the end, we're going to do an activity. And all you need is a piece of paper and something to write with. So just so you can record your thoughts and your ideas throughout the activity. And you'll have the opportunity at the end of the activity to share if you would like, but you don't have to, it's not required. So the burning question, what is biomedical engineering? And basically the short answer to that is that biomedical engineering is the application of engineering principles in order to solve problems in medicine. But it's really a lot more than that. It's a very highly interdisciplinary field. We combine strategies from other engineering disciplines like chemical, mechanical, electrical, environmental, and computer engineering with concepts from fields outside of engineering, such as biology, chemistry, robotics, computer science, medicine, physical therapy, etc. We really pull in a lot of different concepts and we collaborate with a lot of different people, which is part of what makes it so interesting and part of what also gives us the tools to tackle a lot of really complex problems, as we're going to see later on in the class. So what are the different areas of BME? These are the four that we're going to talk about today, but I just want to highlight that every college, every university, even every biomedical engineer you might talk to breaks it up differently. These aren't the only four areas. Some people might call them different things. They might combine different areas. As you can see in the diagram on the right, there are a lot of different areas that fit under this umbrella of bioengineering or BME. This is just the way that my college broke it up. So this is the system that I'm used to. We had four different concentrations. We had biomechanics and mechanobiology. We had cell and tissue engineering. We had imaging and signal processing, and we had medical devices and implants. So that's the way we're going to split it up today, just to make it easy to sort of wrap your brain around. But in real life, you'll find that it is not so cut and dry. So the first one we're going to talk about is biomechanics and mechanobiology. Just to give a brief definition of each one before we dive into the specific examples. Biomechanics is pretty much what it sounds like. It investigates how movement and mechanical forces affect biological systems. And in this context, we're looking at things like bones, joints, or perhaps the entire limb, like an entire arm, an entire leg, or even an entire body as a whole. You might already be familiar with biomechanics if you're really into sports, or if you've gone to physical therapy for an injury, or if you have a friend who went to physical therapy, or if you're into sports, you might have seen videos of professional athletes being analyzed and being studied by scientists as they do things like run on a treadmill or do different exercises. Or if you're really into video games, some video game companies want really realistic graphics in the way the characters move. So they'll use some sort of motion capture technology where they'll attach sensors to an actor at different joints on their body, and then they'll record them with a special camera so they can keep track of where all these sensors are in space, so that then when they develop the video game characters, they can move in a really realistic fashion. So that could also be interpreted as a form of biomechanics as well. Mechanobiology, on the other hand, I know it sounds like it's pretty much the same thing, and it basically is the same concept, but at a much smaller scale. So instead of focusing on an entire limb, an entire body, or an entire joint like a knee or a hip, we're focusing on individual cells or small groups of cells and how they interact. So mechanobiology, we focus on how those mechanical forces alter the properties, the development, or the behavior of individual cells or small groups of cells. So same concept, different scales. First example we're going to talk about for biomechanics is prosthetic legs. Prosthetic limbs in general are super common, and we're going to focus on legs in particular because they have that weight-bearing component. They need to be able to support the person. And they actually have a lot of layers of complexity because they need to be optimized and customized for each recipient, depending on things like their age, their weight, their height, their activity level, and even the type of amputation. So for example, if a patient has an above the knee versus a below the knee amputation, that changes a lot of the parameters that we need to consider as biomedical engineers. The reason for that is because an above the knee prosthetic has to recreate that knee joint that's been lost. It can't just be a solid piece of material that's not capable of bending. It needs to be able to bend smoothly as the person is taking those steps, but it also needs to be strong enough to not buckle when they're placing their full weight on that leg. And the reason for that is that if a person has a very awkward gait, if they're moving from side to side, or if they're not able to really bend their legs properly, not only does that waste energy, but that can cause problems down the line with their hips or their spine or their other leg if they're using their other leg to compensate. So there are a lot of factors to take into account here if we want to go into this field of biomechanics. Now, on the other side of things, mechanobiology, the example we're going to talk about here is patients who are paralyzed due to some sort of injury or some sort of disease. If they're paralyzed from the neck down or from the waist down, basically if they're not walking anymore, they're actually at a very high risk of osteoporosis. And as a result of that osteoporosis, they're at a very high risk of fractures in those bones. And the reason for that is because bone is mechanoadaptive, which is exactly what it sounds like. It adapts to mechanical forces. We often think of bone as just this sort of static thing that's just there and doesn't really change throughout our lives, but there are actually lots of cells, as you can see in the diagram on the right. There are lots of cells that live inside the bone, and these cells are constantly replenishing the bone tissue. They're constantly eating away and removing old tissue and replacing it with new tissue to maintain that strength. But they do this on their own. They do this in response to physical forces. So when you're walking, running, jumping, just in your daily life, that repetitive force on those cells, they respond to that by replenishing the bone. If you take that force away, for example, in someone who's paralyzed and no longer able to walk, those cells aren't feeling that force anymore. And as a result, they stop replenishing the bone, which can lead to osteoporosis. If you've ever seen an image of what a bone looks like in osteoporosis, you know that it looks very brittle. It looks very sparse on the inside. There's a lot of empty space and a lot less bone tissue than in a healthy bone. So the reason for this is the reason why these patients are at such high risk of fractures, because their bones become very brittle. The subfield out of those four, the second one we're going to talk about is cell and tissue engineering. And these are also pretty self-explanatory. So cellular engineering, we're focusing on individual cells. We're altering the DNA, the structure, or the behavior of individual cells or groups of cells in order to treat diseases. And this has been investigated in the context of things like cancer, but also a lot of genetic diseases as well that don't really have any existing treatments or any existing cures. Tissue engineering, on the other hand, again, we're focusing, instead of on the individual cellular level, we're focusing on an entire piece of tissue, whether that's a piece of tissue like the skin, or if it's an entire organ even. Tissue engineering has also been explored in the context of entire organs like tissue engineered eyes or tissue engineered hearts. And basically the main goal of tissue engineering is to address shortages of donor organs. So patients, if they need a transplant, they often have to wait a very long time on a wait list before a donor organ becomes available. Tissue engineering aims to address that. And just to provide some context, this field of cellular engineering and tissue engineering is sometimes referred to collectively as regenerative medicine, just to give you a frame of reference in case you hear that term in the future. So like we said, one of the things that cellular engineering is being investigated for is cancer specifically. And in that context, it's usually referred to as immunotherapy. So people might know someone who has had cancer, they often receive chemotherapy, and as a result of that chemotherapy, they usually become very, very sick. It's very hard on the body. And the reason for that is because chemotherapy agents aren't capable of distinguishing between healthy cells and cancer cells. So in addition to killing all the cancer cells, they also kill a lot of healthy cells, which is what causes that extreme sickness when a patient is on chemotherapy. So ideally, we want to destroy the cancer cells without making the patients extremely sick, because they're also losing a lot of healthy cells. If you follow the diagram on the right, you can see how immunotherapy aims to do this. Basically, a patient would have their blood drawn, just as if you were donating blood or having blood drawn at the doctor's office. And then the white blood cells are isolated from that blood sample. You can see in this diagram, they've highlighted a specific type of white blood cell called a T cell. And then these T cells, once they're isolated from the rest of the blood, they're treated with a virus that inserts a gene into their DNA. And that gene is what makes them capable of distinguishing between cancer cells and healthy cells. Once they've been treated, once that gene has been inserted, then those cells are expanded just in a laboratory environment in a petri dish or some other type of dish, and kept in an incubator for a couple weeks until there is a large enough quantity of them for them to have a therapeutic effect. And once you have enough of them, then you infuse those cells back into the patient. And then in theory, the T cells will be capable of destroying the cancer cells now that they've received that gene that allows them to recognize them, without destroying the healthy cells along the way. So there's a lot of research being done in this area nowadays. There's a lot of companies looking into immunotherapy. It's been showing a lot of promise. If you guys have any questions, I haven't been checking the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself. Remember, if anything isn't clear, feel free to chime in. So moving on to tissue engineering, like we said, tissue engineering aims to address shortages of donor organs. People who need transplants often have to spend a lot of time on a wait list before they can receive that donor organ. But another problem is that even after they receive that donor organ, they usually have to take immunosuppressants for the rest of their lives to prevent their body from rejecting that organ, since their immune system will, of course, recognize that that organ is a foreign material. It's not part of the self, so it will recognize it as non-self and attack it. And that's very cumbersome. Those immunosuppressants are also very harsh on the body. So tissue engineering aims to address both of those problems. If you follow the diagram on the right, you can see basically how it would work. In this context, in this example, they use the example of a tissue engineered bladder. So say a person has bladder cancer or some other condition that requires a transplant. In this context, instead of having a transplant, you could take a biopsy or a sample of the person's tissue, either from the bladder or potentially from somewhere else in the body. And then you isolate out those cells, and similar to cellular engineering, you just grow them in a dish, in a petri dish or a well plate, and keep them in an incubator for a couple weeks until you have a large enough quantity and they've multiplied enough times. And then those cells are seeded onto a scaffold, which just provides the structure. It provides a place for them to attach to. It makes sure they grow into the correct shape. And these scaffolds can be made of a variety of different materials. They can be made of natural materials like alginate, which is derived from algae, or they could be made from cellulose, which is derived from plants, or they could be made of synthetic materials like different types of plastics. So, of course, after this has grown for a sufficient amount of time, the cells have grown over the scaffold and occupied all of the space. Then that scaffold with the cells attached to it can be implanted back into the body and integrate into the existing tissue. So it would provide a pretty seamless integration. It's not like a foreign device made of metal or some other sort of synthetic material. And it's the patient's own cells. So the immune system won't recognize it as foreign and won't attack it. And there's also a lot of research being done in this area of research as well. The next category we're going to talk about is imaging and signal processing. And imaging is really, really frequently used in BME and in medicine in general. If you've ever had an MRI or a CAT scan or an X-ray, you know it can be used to diagnose injuries and diseases. It can inform treatment decisions, and it can also be used to plan surgeries if a surgery is very complex or very risky. While signal processing, on the other hand, is often associated with imaging because we use signal processing to analyze large quantities of data. And this data is often in the form of images, or it might come from images, in order to do things like, again, predict patient outcomes or diagnose diseases as well. So the example we're going to talk about for imaging is imaging of aneurysms. And if you're not familiar with aneurysms, basically an aneurysm is when a blood vessel balloons outwards in response to the blood pressure, and it keeps growing until it eventually bursts, which can be fatal if it occurs someplace like the brain, or if it's in a very large artery like the aorta, which is right next to the heart. So large aneurysms are very, very risky. And if a patient is known to have an aneurysm or is known to have a predisposition to forming aneurysms in their body, they're often monitored very closely with this type of imaging known as angiography. You can see on the right, this person has an aneurysm in their brain. All the blood vessels in their brain have been highlighted using a fluorescent dye. And if you look right around behind where their eyes would be, you can see that aneurysm almost in the center of the image. So angiography, it can be used to diagnose aneurysms. It can be used to monitor them to see if they're growing or how fast they're growing. It can be used to plan out the surgery, and it might also be used after surgery to determine whether or not the surgeon was successful in treating that aneurysm. And the place where biomedical engineers come into play is we might improve the imaging software or the imaging technology to try and get maybe higher resolution images so we can see a higher degree of detail. We might want to improve the technology, the device itself, such as improving an MRI machine to make it less expensive or to make it smaller. If anybody's seen an MRI machine, you know they're really big, really cumbersome. So biomedical engineers might try to make these types of technologies smaller or more portable or less expensive so that more patients can have access to this technology. So signal processing, we're going to talk about those robotic surgeons. You might have seen articles or YouTube videos about, there's been a lot of hype lately about these robotic surgeons. So say a doctor is in another country or on another continent from the patient, but the patient needs to be treated by this doctor who's a specialist. Theoretically, instead of either one of them traveling, you could have a surgeon that the doctor, a surgical robot that the doctor controls almost as if they were in a video game, sort of. But of course, somebody has to build that robot. Even though the surgeon is the one doing the surgery, someone needs to build the robot. So this could be another place where biomedical engineers can lend a hand. And these researchers were looking at a robotic arm to control the location of a surgical device, in this case, ultrasonic surgical devices that can destroy tumors in sensitive areas or near vital organs. So basically, this algorithm, you can see it's summarized on the right in this handy flowchart. This algorithm takes in large quantities of data on the location of the device, say where it is and what its coordinates are in the X, Y, and Z directions. And it takes in that information and runs it through the algorithm and then checks to see if that's the correct location that it's supposed to be in. And if it's not correct, it can adjust the location accordingly so that it is in the correct location for the surgeon. All right, so the last category we're going to talk about is medical devices and implants. These are super, super prevalent. They comprise things like insulin pumps, dialysis machines, pacemakers, heart-lung machines, hip replacements, knee replacements. They're very, very ubiquitous in our society, and they can treat and diagnose and treat a huge variety of diseases. So medical devices are, of course, self-explanatory, and then implants just add an extra parameter in that these are medical devices that are implanted inside the body. So there are some extra considerations we have to take into account. And this subfield is really interesting because it combines medicine with a lot of concepts from mechanical engineering and electrical engineering as well. So you have things like fluid mechanics, materials science, circuits and electrical engineering, and even product design if you're interested in that aspect of it. All of that is encompassed in this subfield, as you can see in this diagram on the right. So one real life example of medical devices we're going to talk about is a hemodialysis machine. And basically this is in patients who have kidney failure or some other sort of kidney disease where their kidneys are not able to function effectively. And they might be on the wait list for a kidney transplant. So while they are waiting, they're usually treated with hemodialysis. So a couple times a week, they go to this center, they sit in this chair, and a needle is inserted into their blood vessel, just as if you were donating blood or giving blood at the doctor's office. And their blood is run through this machine next to them, and then it goes out a different tube and into a different needle back into their arm. So this machine is able to completely replace their kidney function. It removes waste products such as creatinine, urea, and potassium while preserving the necessary ions and the water concentration that they need. So there, you can see there's a lot of different buttons, a lot of different dials and switches on this machine. There are a lot of different parameters that need to be monitored. We need to optimize the patient's blood pressure. We want to make sure their blood volume is correct. We don't want to take out too much water or contribute too much water. We need to keep that blood pH in the correct range. And then we also need to make sure we don't have any air bubbles, which could theoretically cause a stroke. And of course, we don't want any fluid leakage. So there's a lot of different components of this machine. We need to take into account the different fluid mechanics, like we said. There's obviously a lot of circuits in it as well. And then we also need to have that underlying medical knowledge of how the kidneys function in order to design this properly. Yeah, so I could explain that a little more. This isn't my area of expertise. My area of expertise is in tissue engineering, but my understanding of signal processing is that you take in large quantities of data. In this case, it's data on the location of the device. Like we said, we could consider that in terms of coordinates in the 3 different planes, the X, Y, and Z directions. And then the machine, if you would write this algorithm, you could compare that with a set of data that's either contributed, it's either already in the machine, or it has been programmed by the surgeon or by another biomedical engineer to determine where the device is supposed to be. So it could compare those 2 values, the coordinates where it is and the coordinates where it's supposed to be. And if those coordinates are equal, it doesn't have to do anything. But if those coordinates are not equal, then it knows to adjust where it is. And you could continuously do that, say, every 10 seconds or every 1 second or every millisecond. Depending on how delicate and how precise this surgery is. And you can continue to compare those values over and over to make sure that you're still in the correct location. So moving on to the concept of implants, like we said, this is a medical device that is physically inside the body. So there's that extra parameter we have to consider there. And the example we're going to use is an artificial pacemaker. These are super common. They might be used to treat a slow or an irregular heartbeat, which could be caused by things like a heart attack, heart failure, or some other heart condition. And this artificial pacemaker is implanted just under the skin near the collarbone. And these electrodes are fed back through the blood vessels into the heart until they reach the correct location. And then the body of the pacemaker generates electrical impulses at regular intervals. Those impulses travel down the leads back into the electrodes in the heart, and that induces the heart to contract at the regular rate we'd like to see. So just another side note, like we said, we need to consider that this is inside the body. So if you're interested in materials science, for example, materials science plays a very big role in implants, and it's often called biomaterials for that reason, because we need to be very careful about what kinds of materials we use. We want to make sure we use things that are non-toxic, of course. We don't want anything to cause an allergic reaction. We don't want it to cause irritation, but we also need to consider that the inside of the body can be a very harsh place. It could be moist if it's in the blood or in the stomach. There could be movement, for example, in the heart that is constantly contracting. We want to choose materials that aren't brittle, that aren't going to break. It needs to be able to be flexible. And there could be different pH values, again, depending on where in the body this implant is placed. You need to consider the pH. You want to make sure you choose materials that aren't going to rust or corrode. And the procedure to place a pacemaker, it's very simple, but if the procedure is very complex, for example, a hip replacement is a very complex surgery, you want to make sure you choose materials that are going to last a super long time. So you don't have to redo that surgery every year, every couple of years. You want this to last decades, ideally. So that's all the specific examples we're going to talk about, but I just wanted to highlight again that these subfields, I know I separated them into those 4 categories. That was just to make things more convenient, but these categories are not separate. There's tons and tons of overlap between these categories, and many problems actually require us to combine things from multiple categories. So you can see in this example on the right, these researchers were working on a treatment for a neuromuscular disorder. For example, that might be something like Parkinson's or something like cerebral palsy. And they actually included aspects of 3 of the 4 categories we talked about today. So you can see on the top left, they have a medical device. On the bottom left, they have some imaging studies. And then on the right, they have some biomechanics components as well. So these subfields are not as cut and dry and separate and isolated as they appear in this PowerPoint. They are very fluid. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of collaboration between them as well. And then just briefly, there are plenty of other areas to explore in BME. These are not the only 4 subfields. There are plenty of other subfields that I didn't have time to go into today. But just to give you an idea, in case you run into these or you hear about these terms, things like bioinformatics and systems biology. There's a lot being done in that area right now. And that is basically using data, using large quantities of biological data to do things like inform treatment decisions or to inform research directions. So for example, you might have a huge quantity of data. Let's say you or someone else has sequenced the DNA of hundreds or thousands of cancer patients. And you can write a program, a bioinformatics program, that will go through and try to find similarities between their DNA. So you might find that all of these patients with a specific type of cancer have this specific type of variant of a gene. And you could compare it to a big database of healthy patient DNA and see that none of the healthy patients have that gene, or vice versa. Healthy patients might have a gene that cancer patients are missing, for example. So that would then inform your decision that we should place more research and more effort into researching this specific gene. On the other hand, computational biology, for example, is basically what it sounds like, using computers to model biological systems. So for example, you might be trying to find a drug that can bind to a specific molecule, but you don't have time to test hundreds or thousands of drugs in real life. So you might try and model the physical structure of the molecule, and then model the physical structure of all these different drugs, and then run it through a simulation to see if those physical structures are able to bind to each other, if they're able to fit together. And you wouldn't have to do any work in real life. You could just do it all in a simulation. Biomaterials we just talked about in the context of implants, and then bionics we talked about a little bit in the context of signal processing, but again, that could be considered like either robotic limbs or robotic surgeons. So now we're going to start the activity, and remember, all you need is a piece of paper and something to write with, just to record your thoughts along the way. And you'll be welcome to share at the end, but it is not required, of course. So imagine you are a biomedical engineer, and this is the problem you want to address. Imagine there's been an outbreak of a parasite that enters the body through a wound in the leg. And once it enters the body, it gradually destroys the tissue, the skin and muscle and bone over time, until eventually the leg needs to be amputated if it can't be salvaged. So how would you go about addressing this problem? And I want to emphasize there is no right answer here. There's no correct answer here. You could take an infinite number of different approaches. So for example, would you want to develop a better diagnostic test so doctors can intervene at an earlier stage of the disease? Would you want to investigate how exactly the parasite destroys the tissue and use that knowledge to create a new drug or a new medication? Would you want to build artificial limbs for those that have already lost their leg or are going to lose their leg? Would you want to design a technique for replacing the diseased tissue with healthy tissue, or something else entirely? These are just some ideas to get you started. And then there were also some other considerations I wanted you to keep in the back of your mind as we work through this. So of course, you might want to think about, what does your solution look like and how does it work? You might want to draw a diagram or a flow chart of some sort as you think through it. You're going to want to think about how you would test this. Would you test it on animals? Would you test it on people? And then, of course, if you're going to do either one of those, there are some ethical implications that you need to grapple with and you need to be able to justify to governing bodies such as the FDA. The FDA needs to approve all new drugs, all new medical devices, and you need to be able to provide sufficient data to show that your device or your technique or your treatment is an improvement over the existing treatment, if there is one. And then some other things to consider. How easy to use is your solution? So for example, is your solution very similar to something that's been done in the past? Doctors are already familiar with it. Patients are already familiar with it. It's not new and scary and strange. Or is it so new that doctors are going to have to spend a lot of time being trained on it before they can use it correctly? And patients won't really know what it is, and you'll need to spend a lot of time explaining to them how it works. Another thing is, how much does your solution cost? Because of course, it doesn't matter if your solution is the most effective thing in the world if no one can afford it. So you need to think about how some patients might not have insurance, some might have insurance, but even if they have insurance, insurance often doesn't want to pay for the most expensive solution, even if it is marginally more effective. So if your solution is going to be very expensive, you need to think about how you can justify that. You need to be able to justify that your solution is so much better than what else is currently available that it's well worth the price. Or conversely, think about ways to make your solution less expensive so you don't even have to have that argument in the first place. Another thing is, how unpleasant or uncomfortable or painful is it for patients? Because of course we want to always consider the end user of this design. The patient is the end user. The patient is the one receiving this treatment or this device or this drug. So we want to think about their experience as well, because that's very important. Again, if your device or your treatment is very uncomfortable, or your device has a lot of, or your medication has a lot of unpleasant side effects, patients won't want to use it even if it's effective. And then finally, how easy is it to transport, implement, or use in rural areas? We might want to think about what our solution requires. Does it require a whole hospital full of expensive equipment? Does it require a full team of doctors and nurses? Does it require electricity? So just things to think about. If patients are located in rural or low income areas, would they still be able to have access to your solution? So obviously, you don't have to address all of these right now. These are just things to get you to start thinking about, just to keep in the back of your mind as you try and think through how you would go about addressing this. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes, and then in 10 minutes, I'm going to work on a solution too. In 10 minutes, then we can come back together and I'll share my solution, and then you guys will be welcome to share your solution as well. So that's all I had for today. Just to summarize what we went over, we learned that biomedical engineering is a super interdisciplinary field. We combine aspects of other engineering disciplines like chemical, mechanical, electrical, environmental, and computer engineering with other concepts outside of engineering. We involve things like medicine, physics, robotics, computer science, material science, physical therapy, etc. So very interdisciplinary, very collaborative. And then we focused on a couple key areas under the umbrella of biomedical engineering. We looked at biomechanics and mechanobiology. We looked at cell and tissue engineering. We looked at imaging and signal processing, and we looked at medical devices and implants. And then I hope your key takeaway from the activity at the end was that problems in biomedical engineering are super open-ended. They're often very complex, very multifaceted, and there's not one clear correct answer or one clear solution that we need to use. We have the opportunity to work together with other scientists, other engineers, doctors, physical therapists, public health experts, etc. And that allows us to create really innovative and really similarly interdisciplinary solutions. Interdisciplinary, you'll hear that a lot in the context of biomedical engineering because it is. So there's no cut and dry answer. We have the opportunity to collaborate with tons and tons of different people, use concepts from a lot of different fields, and combine all those into a very innovative and hopefully very effective and very successful solution.